I remember the first time I heard it. A whisper. Soft and elusive. Like a shadow flickering at the edge of my perception. It was a Tuesday. A day like any other in my monotonous college routine. My name is Brett. A sophomore, majoring in history. A subject I chose more out of a lack of direction than passion. I live alone in a small apartment just off campus, my days spent between lectures, the library, and the quiet of my room. That evening, as I sat studying, the whispering began. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps my neighbors, but it persisted. The quiet murmur, unintelligible yet insistent. I tried to focus on my textbook, but the whispering, like an itch I couldn't scratch, demanded my attention. I searched my apartment, checking the windows, the walls, even the old radiator. But found nothing. It was in this fruitless search that I realized the sound wasn't external. It was coming from inside me. A voice without a source. A ghostly echo resonating from within my own body. The rational part of my mind fought for a logical explanation. Stress, perhaps, or the beginnings of a mental breakdown. I had heard of students cracking under pressure. But this felt different. More real and distinct than a mere figment of imagination. That night, I lay in bed. The whispering a constant companion. I tried to decipher it, to understand its language, but it was like listening to a conversation through a thick wall. Present, yet inaccessible. The following days were blur. I attended lectures, but the whispering made concentration impossible. I stopped talking to my friends. Their concern only adding to the cacophony in my head. I was drowning in a sea of whispers, and I considered seeking help, but what would I say? That I was hearing voices, but not from the outside, from within. I could imagine the skepticism, the raised eyebrows. So, I kept it to myself, a secret burden that grew heavier with each passing day. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They formed words, sentences, a language I didn't understand, yet one that filled me with an inexplicable dread. The voice, no longer just a whisper, was now a constant presence, a specter that haunted my every waking moment. I began to document the voice's words, filling a journal with a strange foreign script. I pored over it, trying to find patterns, meanings, anything that could provide insight into this nightmare. But it remained a mystery, an enigma wrapped in the shadows of my own mind. It was during one of my increasingly rare visits to the library that I met Mrs. Eldridge. She was an elderly librarian, her eyes sharp and inquisitive behind thick glasses. I had been muttering to myself, repeating the voice's latest utterance, when she approached me. "You seem troubled, young man," she said, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. I hesitated, then, driven by a desperate need for understanding, I told her about the voice. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss my story. Instead, she listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. "I may know of something that could help," she said, her voice low. "Meet me here tomorrow evening. There are things we need to discuss." That night, I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since the whispering began. Little did I know, my journey into the depths of this nightmare was just beginning. I returned to the library the next evening, my mind a whirlwind of questions and doubts. Mrs. Eldridge was already there, waiting for me in a secluded corner surrounded by ancient leather-bound books. Her eyes, when they met mine, held a seriousness that sent a shiver down my spine. "Brett," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "what you're experiencing isn't unheard of in certain darker circles of knowledge." She pulled out a thick dust-covered tome, and began flipping through its pages, filled with strange symbols and texts in languages I couldn't recognize. "Long ago," she continued, "there were beliefs in spirits that could bind themselves to a person, not unlike a parasite. These entities could communicate through the host, often leading to madness or worse." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. "Are you saying something is inside me?" "It's possible," she replied, her expression grave. "These spirits were known to be manipulative, feeding on the host's fears and secrets." The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke. The voice, my unwelcome companion, remained silent, as if listening intently. "What can I do?" I asked, a sense of desperation creeping into my voice. Mrs. Eldridge closed the book with a thud, her gaze piercing into mine. "There are ways to expel such entities, but the process is dangerous and not without risks. Are you willing to take that chance?" I nodded, the fear of living with the voice outweighing any potential danger. "Very well," she said, standing up. "Meet me at the old Henderson building on the outskirts of town, tomorrow night. It's been abandoned for years, but it will serve our needs." The Henderson building was notorious among the students, a place of ghost stories and dares. The thought of going there, especially at night, sent a shiver through me, but the prospect of silencing the voice gave me the courage I needed. The following night, as instructed, I made my way to the abandoned building. The structure loomed ominously against the night sky, its windows like dark unblinking eyes. Mrs. Eldridge was already there, carrying a small satchel filled with candles, herbs, and other items I couldn't identify. "We must be quick," she said, her voice urgent. "Once we begin, the entity will do everything in its power to stop us." We set up in what must have once been the building's main hall, the decaying walls and broken furniture, creating a scene straight out of a horror movie. Mrs. Eldridge arranged the candles in a circle and began chanting in a language I didn't understand. As she chanted, the air grew thick, the darkness seeming to pulsate with unseen energy. The voice inside me stirred, its words a hissing whisper that sent waves of pain through my body. "Is this it, Brett?" Mrs. Eldridge urged, her voice steady despite the growing chaos. "Focus on my voice, on the words I speak." I tried to concentrate, but the voice was relentless, its whispers turning into screams, filling my head with terror and agony. Suddenly, the building shook, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. I could feel the entity writhing within me, a serpent coiled around my soul. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The voice fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting. I collapsed, exhausted and shaking, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, my mind was my own. Mrs. Eldridge helped me to my feet, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "It's done," she said, her voice weary. "The entity is gone." I wanted to believe her, to embrace the silence in my head, but a nagging doubt remained. Had we truly banished the voice, or had we merely silenced it for now? As I left the Henderson building, the weight of uncertainty hung heavy on my shoulders. The voice was gone, but the shadows it had cast on my soul remained. The days following the ritual were surreal. The absence of the voice was both a relief and a source of constant anxiety. I kept waiting for it to return, for the whispering to start again, but it remained silent. Life started to return to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such an experience. I returned to my classes, trying to catch up on the work I had neglected. My friends, whom I had distanced myself from, welcomed me back, though I could see the concern in their eyes. They asked questions, but I gave them vague answers. How could I explain the unexplainable? Nights were the hardest. I lay in bed, the silence deafening, my mind racing. One evening, as I sat trying to focus on a textbook, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Eldridge. "Brett," she said, her voice tense, "I need to see you. There are things we must discuss." We met at a small cafe, away from prying ears. She looked troubled, more so than usual. "I've been doing more research," she began, her eyes scanning the room before returning to me. "What we dealt with, it might not be over." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" "The entity that was within you, it might have been more powerful than I initially thought. These spirits, they can be persistent. It might be lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge." Panic gripped me. "So, what do we do?" "There's a place," she said, lowering her voice. "An old library in the next town. It holds ancient texts that might contain the information we need to permanently rid you of this entity." The thought of going through another ritual, of facing that voice again, was terrifying. But the alternative, living in fear of its return, was worse. "We need to be careful," she continued. "These spirits, they don't take kindly to being banished. They can be vindictive." I nodded, a sense of determination settling over me. I had come too far to let fear control me. Whatever it took, I was ready to face it. The library was an hour's drive away, a grand old building filled with dusty tomes and forgotten knowledge. Mrs. Eldridge seemed to know exactly where to go, leading me to a secluded section in the back. For hours, we pored over ancient texts, translating and deciphering the cryptic writings. The more we read, the more I realized how little we knew about the world's hidden, darker corners. Finally, as the library's closing time approached, Mrs. Eldridge found something. "Here," she said, pointing to a passage in a worn leather-bound book. "This might be our answer." The text spoke of a ritual, older and more powerful than the one we had performed. But it required specific items, some of which were not easy to obtain. "We'll need to prepare," she said, closing the book. "This won't be easy, and it won't be without risk. But it's our best chance." As we left the library, the weight of our task loomed over us. The voice might have been silent, but its presence, its threat, lingered in the shadows of my mind. The fight was far from over, and I knew that the real battle was yet to come. In the days that followed, Mrs. Eldridge and I gathered the items needed for the ritual. Some were simple, like certain herbs and candles, but others were more obscure and difficult to acquire. We traveled to distant towns, visiting antique shops and meeting with individuals who delved in the arcane and the occult. As we prepared, I could feel a growing sense of dread. The voice remained silent, but its silence was like the calm before a storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Finally, with all the necessary items collected, we set a date for the ritual. It was to take place in an old chapel in the woods, a place Mrs. Eldridge said was steeped in ancient energies conducive to our purpose. The night of the ritual, the air was thick with anticipation. The chapel, long abandoned, stood as a solemn sentinel amongst the gnarled trees. Inside, the moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting eerie shadows across the stone floor. Mrs. Eldridge set up the ritual circle with meticulous care, placing each item at specific points. She then began to chant, her voice echoing in the hollow space. I stood in the center of the circle, trying to focus, to prepare myself for what was to come. As the ritual progressed, the atmosphere in the chapel changed. The air grew colder, and a palpable tension seemed to weave around us. Then, without warning, the voice returned. It was louder and more forceful than before, its whispers like icy fingers on my spine. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but its intent was clear. It was angry, vengeful. "Don't listen to it," Mrs. Eldridge shouted over the rising wind. "Focus on my voice, on the ritual." I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the voice, but it was inside me, in my head, impossible to ignore. It felt as if it was tearing me apart from the inside, a storm of malice and hate. Then, suddenly, the voice changed. It began speaking in English, its words a taunting sneer. It told me things, terrible things, secrets about my past, about my fears. It knew everything about me, every dark thought, every hidden shame. I felt my resolve weakening, the voice's words eating away at my sanity. But Mrs. Eldridge's voice, steady and unwavering, anchored me. She was chanting louder now, the words of the ritual cutting through the darkness. The voice screamed in rage, a sound so terrible it seemed to shake the very foundations of the chapel. But then, as Mrs. Eldridge reached the climax of the ritual, a blinding light filled the room. In that light, I saw the entity. It was a shadowy form, a twisting, writhing mass of darkness. It looked at me, its gaze filled with malice, and then, with a final ear-shattering scream, it was gone. The light faded, and the chapel was silent. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and drained. Mrs. Eldridge rushed to my side, helping me to sit up. "It's done," she said, a look of relief on her face. "The entity is gone, banished back to wherever it came from." I wanted to believe her, to embrace the silence in my mind. The part of me feared it was only temporary, that the voice would return. As we left the chapel, the dawn was breaking, the first light of morning piercing the darkness. The world seemed different somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. But as we drove back to town, a nagging doubt remained. Was it truly over? Or was the silence just a calm before another, even greater storm? The days after the ritual passed in a blur of mundane normalcy. Classes, assignments, and the chatter of daily life resumed, but beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease flowed through me. The voice was gone, yet its echo lingered in the corners of my mind, like a nightmare fading upon waking. Mrs. Eldridge kept in touch, her messages a blend of concern and academic curiosity. She continued her research, delving into the origins of the entity that had plagued me. Her findings were a mix of esoteric theories and obscure folklore, but nothing concrete. The entity remained a mystery, a shadow from a realm beyond our understanding. My friends noticed a change in me. I was quieter, more withdrawn. They tried to engage me, to draw me out, but how could I explain the inexplicable? I smiled, nodded, and played my part, all the while feeling like an actor on a stage. Sleep, when it came, was restless. I dreamed of dark places and whispered voices. The chapel, the ritual, the entity there replayed in my mind, fragments of a puzzle I couldn't solve. I woke each morning feeling drained, as if I had battled demons in my sleep. One evening, as I walked home from the library, a sense of unease washed over me. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of the campus replaced by an eerie stillness. I quickened my pace, the echoes of my footsteps, a staccato rhythm in the empty air. As I reached my apartment, I paused. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning. My heart raced. Had I forgotten to close it? Or was it something else, something more sinister? I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The apartment was dark, the shadows thick and clinging. I reached for the light switch, but hesitated. A primal part of me feared what the light might reveal. Taking a deep breath, I flipped the switch. The apartment was as I had left it, nothing out of place. I let out a sigh of relief, chiding myself for my paranoia. But as I moved to close the door, a whisper caressed my ear. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves. My breath caught in my throat. Was it the voice, returned to haunt me? I stood frozen, listening. But the whisper was gone, replaced by the silent watchfulness of the night. I closed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. That night, I lay in bed, the darkness a tangible presence in the room. The whisper, whether real or imagined, had shaken me. I realized then that the voice, even in its absence, had left its mark on me. I was a prisoner of my own mind, haunted by the fear of its return. As sleep finally claimed me, I wondered if I would ever be free of the voice, or if it would forever be a shadow, lurking in the depths of my soul. The following days were a descent into a different kind of horror, one not of voices and entities, but of silence and shadows. The world around me seemed to move on, but I was trapped in a liminal space, caught between reality and the echoes of the unseen. I tried to immerse myself in my studies, to lose myself in the normalcy of student life, but the attempt was futile. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like a mausoleum of forgotten truths. The books whispered secrets in silent tongues, their words blurring into a cacophony of silent screams. My interactions with others became strained, their voices distant, as if muffled by an invisible barrier. I smiled and nodded, but my mind was elsewhere, listening for a whisper that never came. Mrs. Eldridge remained a constant presence, her messages a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. She suggested therapy, thinking it might help with the after-effects of my ordeal. I considered it, but the thought of explaining my experience to a stranger, to relive it in clinical detail, was more than I could bear. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, the silence became oppressive, a physical weight that threatened to suffocate me. In a moment of desperation, I found myself speaking aloud. "Are you there?" I asked the emptiness. "Are you still with me?" But there was no answer, only the echo of my own voice in the silent room. I laughed, a sound that was more a sob, the absurdity of my situation overwhelming me. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The voice did not return, but its absence was as haunting as its presence. I was a ship adrift on a sea of silence, the shore nowhere in sight. The end of the semester came, a conclusion to a chapter of my life that I was eager to close. I packed my things, the mundane act of balm to my frayed nerves. I was ready to leave, to put distance between me and the memories that haunted me. As I locked the door to my apartment for the last time, I paused. A sense of finality washed over me, the closing of a door both literal and metaphorical. I looked away, the weight of my experiences a heavy cloak upon my shoulders. The voice was gone, but it had changed me, shaped me in ways I was still trying to understand. As I stepped into the future, the past lingered, a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the corner of my eye. The voice was silent, but its echo remained, a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. And in that silence, I found a new understanding that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some voices better left unheard. For in the realm of the unseen, the truth is often more terrifying than any fiction.